She was barefoot, 2 days out of surgery, stitches still pulling against her skin, hospital gown stained with blood she hadn't had time to wash away, holding 2 newborn babies against a chest that could barely rise and fall without agony, and she was barefoot on gravel, walking away from a mansion that glowed behind her like a life she'd already been erased from. And the last words she heard before the iron gate clanged shut, they didn't come from her husband. They came from his mother, a woman draped in silk, standing in a doorway paid for by the very family she despised. And she looked at Nadine, looked through her, and said 6 words that would echo through courtrooms, newsrooms, and history. Your kind always manages, dear. Your kind. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if you gave someone everything, your love, your trust, your body, 6 years of your life, and they threw you away like you were nothing? What would you do if they put you and your newborn babies on the street in the middle of the night and then laughed about it? What would you do if the family you married into looked at the color of your skin and decided that was all they needed to know about you? Because that's exactly what happened to Nadine Okafor, a woman who loved so deeply it blinded her, a woman who walked into a family that smiled to her face and sharpened knives behind her back, a woman who was humiliated, degraded, and expelled from her own home, with her 2-day-old twins still wrapped in hospital blankets. But here's where this story takes a turn that nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming. What the Ashworth family didn't know, what they never even suspected, was that the mansion they just threw her out of, it belonged to her father. The money in the accounts her husband had been spending for 6 years, her father's, the business, the cars, the investments, the lifestyle they flaunted on social media like they'd earned it. Every single dollar traced back to a man named Solomon Okafor, a man they thought was dead, a man who'd been watching every single moment from the shadows. And when he pulled up to that estate in a motorcade that stopped traffic, when he stepped out and looked his daughter's husband in the eye, everything the Ashworth family believed about power, about class, about who was really beneath whom, shattered into a million irreversible pieces. Now before we dive into how Solomon Okafor dismantled this family from the ground up, if you want to see the moment he steps out of that Bentley, the look on Constance Ashworth's face when she realizes the woman she called your kind was the woman who owned her entire world, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what time it is where you're watching from. Because trust me, what happens next in this story is going to give you chills. Let's go back to the beginning. The chandelier in the Ashworth foyer threw cold, fractured light across marble floors that Nadine had once thought were beautiful. She'd stood in this entryway 3 years ago, the first time Julian brought her home, and thought she'd stepped into a fairy tale. The sweeping staircase, the oil paintings, the scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden, it all felt like a promise. She didn't know then that fairy tales have villains, and she didn't know that sometimes the villain is the man holding your hand. It was 11:47 at night. Nadine stood in the center of the foyer wearing a hospital gown under a thin cardigan, her twins, 2 days old, impossibly small, impossibly fragile, bundled against her chest. Her body screamed from the C-section. Every breath tugged at stitches that weren't ready for movement. Her legs trembled. Her vision blurred at the edges. And in front of her stood 3 people who wanted her gone. Constance Ashworth came first, Julian's mother, the woman who ran this family like a corporation and treated everyone beneath her tax bracket like furniture. She stood at the foot of the staircase in a cream silk robe, her silver hair perfect even at midnight, her face arranged into an expression that wasn't anger or hatred. It was dismissal. Like Nadine was a stain on marble that simply needed to be wiped away. "I've been patient," Constance said, her voice clipped and measured. 3 years I've tolerated this arrangement, but I will not have my grandchildren, if they even are my grandchildren, raised in confusion. This family has a legacy, a standard, and you, my dear, have never met it. Nadine's arms tightened around the twins. "Constance, the babies are 2 days old. I just had surgery. Please, just let me stay until morning." Morning. Constance repeated the word like it tasted sour. And then what? Another morning, another week, another year of watching you stumble through dinners you can't host, conversations you can't hold, a life you were never built for? No, this ends tonight. Julian stood behind his mother. Her husband, the man who had knelt in the rain outside a bookshop in Lagos 3 years ago, held her face in his hands and told her she was the most extraordinary woman he'd ever met. The man who wrote her poetry the first year, bought her flowers the second, and stopped looking at her entirely by the third. He said nothing. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set, and his eyes, The eyes she'd fallen into like water were empty. Not angry, not sad, empty, like she'd already ceased to exist. Julian. Her voice broke on his name. Say something. These are your daughters. He flinched. Just barely, just for a fraction of a second. Then a hand slid onto his forearm. Manicured nails, a gold bracelet, and the flinch disappeared. Priscilla Langdon stepped out from behind him like she'd been waiting for her cue. She wore Nadine's silk robe, the one Julian had given Nadine for her birthday. Her smile was slow, deliberate, and devastating. Not because it was cruel, but because it was comfortable. She wasn't performing. She belonged here. Or at least, she believed she did. This is uncomfortable for everyone, Priscilla said, her voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy. Maybe it's better if you just go quietly, for the baby's sake. For the baby's sake. The words hit Nadine like a slap. She looked at Julian one more time, searched his face for something, anything, that resembled the man she'd married. She found nothing. I gave you everything, Nadine whispered. 6 years, my whole life. I left my country, my family, my career, everything, because you said you loved me. Julian's jaw tightened. Then he spoke, the first words he'd said all night. And they were the words that would haunt courtrooms and headlines for months to come. You were useful for a while, Nadine, I'll give you that. But useful has an expiration date, and yours passed the moment those babies were born. Constance nodded like he'd said something reasonable. Priscilla squeezed his arm like he'd said something brave. And Nadine felt something inside her chest collapse. Not her heart. Something deeper. The structure she'd built her entire identity on. The belief that love was enough. That being good, being faithful, being patient would eventually be rewarded. It collapsed silently, completely, like a building imploding in slow motion. Fine, she said, and her voice came out steady, so steady it surprised even her. I'll go. She turned, walked toward the door. Each step was fire. Each step was a negotiation between her body's breaking and her mind's refusal to stop. Behind her, Priscilla's laugh cut through the foyer. High, bright, careless. She's not even going to fight. How pathetic. Nadine didn't turn around. She couldn't, because if she turned around, she would break. And she could not break. Not with 2 lives pressed against her chest, depending on her heartbeat to feel safe. The front door closed behind her. Heavy, final, the sound of a life ending. She made it to the iron gate. It swung open, automatic, indifferent, and deposited her onto the private lane that wound through the Ashworth property. Elm trees arched overhead like the ribs of some vast, indifferent creature. The nearest town was 4 miles away. The road was gravel. She was barefoot. Her feet began to bleed within the first quarter mile. She didn't feel it at first. The cold had numbed everything below her ankles. But then one of the twins stirred, whimpered, and the sound cracked something open inside her. She stopped walking, stood in the middle of a dark road, under trees that blocked the stars, her body failing, her babies crying, and spoke out loud to no one. Mama has you. Mama's right here. We're going to be fine. She didn't know if she was lying. Her phone had 11% battery. 3 contacts she trusted, 2 in Nigeria, 1 in London. No one within 100 miles who could reach her before morning. She was alone in a way she had never been alone in her life. Not just physically, spiritually. Every bridge she'd crossed to get to this country, to this family, to this man, they'd all been burned behind her. And the person who'd held the matches was the person she'd trusted most. She kept walking, because there was nothing else to do. Because stopping meant dying, and her daughters needed her alive. Then her phone buzzed. The screen glowed in the darkness like a signal flare. Unknown number, 2 messages. The first one read, "Walk to the end of the lane. A car is waiting." The second, "Dad." Nadine stopped breathing. Her father, Solomon Okafor, had been dead for 19 months. A helicopter crash in the mountains outside Nairobi. A routine flight to inspect a warehouse facility he managed. The wreckage was found. The bodies were not. He was declared dead after a 6-month search that yielded nothing. Nadine had grieved him in silence, in the corners of the Ashworth estate where no one watched. Julian had told her mourning was unproductive. Constance had called funerals a spectacle she didn't care to attend. So Nadine had mourned alone, at night, in the bathroom, with the water running so no one could hear her cry. And now, his name was on her phone. Her first thought was cruelty. Someone was playing a sick joke. Her second thought was madness. Maybe the pain, the exhaustion, the betrayal had finally broken something in her mind. Her third thought was desperate, irrational hope, the kind that lives in the basement of your soul and refuses to die no matter how many times you try to bury it. Another message appeared. I know you're scared, Nadi. I know you have questions, but right now I need you to trust me. Walk to the end of the lane. Nadi. No one called her that. No one except him. A childhood nickname that lived in a language and a memory no one in this country had access to. She walked. Not because she believed, because she had nowhere else to go. Because the alternative was collapse on a gravel road with 2 newborns and 11% battery. Because even the ghost of her father was better company than the silence. The car was there. A black armored SUV parked beneath the last elm tree, engine humming, headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. The rear door opened before she reached it, and a woman stepped out. Tall, composed, dark suit that fit like authority itself, eyes that assessed and calculated in a single glance. She moved with the kind of precision that came from years of navigating rooms full of powerful men and making them listen. Nadine Okafor? The woman's voice was calm, certain. My name is Vivienne Trask. I'm your father's attorney. He sent me to bring you somewhere safe. Nadine stared at her. Rain she hadn't noticed was falling now, thin, cold, persistent. Her baby shivered against her chest. My father is dead. Vivienne's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Not pity, not sympathy, something closer to respect for the weight of what Nadine was carrying. No, ma'am, he's not. She held up her phone. On the screen was a photograph. Solomon Okafor, alive, thinner than Nadine remembered, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. He held a small whiteboard. On it, in his handwriting, the handwriting she'd know anywhere, the careful block letters of a man who believed penmanship was discipline, were 2 things, today's date and a line from an Igbo lullaby, the one her mother used to sing before she passed, the one only 3 people in the world had ever known. NWAM, NWAM, Anyiga-di-ma. My child, we will be all right. Nadine's knees buckled. Vivienne caught her, one arm around her shoulders, the other steadying the twins, and guided her into the SUV. The interior was warm, clean. A private nurse waited inside, already reaching for the babies with practiced, gentle hands. We have formula, diapers, blankets, everything you need, Vivienne said, sliding in beside her. There's a penthouse in the financial district, private, secure. Your father arranged it months ago. We've been waiting for this night. Nadine looked at her, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with cold and shock, and the impossible collision of grief and hope. Waiting? Vivienne's jaw tightened. Your father knew this would happen, Nadine. He didn't know when, but he knew it would, and he made sure that when it did you wouldn't be alone, not for 1 second longer than necessary. The SUV pulled away from the elm tree. In the rearview mirror, the Ashworth estate shrank and disappeared, swallowed by darkness and distance. Nadine pressed her face against the window and let herself cry. Not the silent, hidden tears she'd learned to shed in that house, but real tears. Loud, broken, the kind that come when you've been holding yourself together for so long that letting go feels like falling off a cliff. But someone had built a net at the bottom, and she was about to find out just how vast that net was. The penthouse occupied the 62nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district. Below, the city sprawled in every direction, lights like scattered diamonds, traffic flowing like blood through concrete veins. Above, the sky was black and starless, the kind of darkness that swallows sound. Nadine sat on a white sofa, wrapped in a cashmere blanket that smelled like nothing, clean and neutral, the scent of a place that had been waiting for someone. The twins slept in a bassinet the nurse had prepared, their breathing synchronized, their tiny hands curled into fists even in sleep, like they were already fighting. A laptop sat open on the coffee table, and on the screen was her father's face. Solomon Okafor looked older, not aged but refined, like a blade that had been sharpened by whatever fire he'd walked through. The scar from the crash traced a pale line from his temple to his jaw. His left hand rested on a cane. The crash had taken something from his leg that surgery couldn't fully restore. But his eyes were exactly the same, deep brown, clear as polished stone, burning with a focus that Nadine had always associated with safety. When he saw her face, he broke. Nadi, his voice cracked. Not the voice of a billionaire or a strategist or a man who'd orchestrated his own disappearance. The voice of a father seeing his daughter after 19 months of enforced silence, knowing every day of suffering she'd endured because he'd chosen to remain hidden. "Papa," the word came out small, a child's word. "You're alive." "I'm alive." "You let me think you were dead." Her voice hardened. 19 months. I grieved you. I cried for you in bathrooms because they wouldn't even let me mourn in the open. I begged Julian to take me to Nigeria for a memorial, and he said it was a waste of time, and you were alive." Solomon closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "I know, and I will carry the weight of that decision every day for the rest of my life. But Nadi, I need you to understand why." "Then explain." Her voice was iron now, not broken, not pleading, demanding. Solomon took a breath, the heavy, measured kind that meant every word had been chosen before it was spoken. "I was never just a warehouse manager, Nadi. That was the story I told to keep you safe, to keep your mother safe. The truth is, I built something. Over 30 years, I built a private equity operation that spans 3 continents. Asset management, infrastructure investments, strategic holdings, quietly, deliberately, under layers of corporate structure that even the most aggressive auditors couldn't untangle. I did it because I grew up with nothing, and I swore my children would never be vulnerable the way I was." Nadine stared at the screen. The words didn't compute. Her father, the man who drove a 10-year-old sedan, who wore the same 3 suits to every occasion, who packed his own lunch in a brown bag, was describing an empire. "I saw Julian the first time you brought him home," Solomon continued. "I saw the way he looked at you, not at your face, not at your heart, at what you represented, access, stability, a woman too kind to ask hard questions. I hired investigators that same week." "You investigated my husband before we were married." "I investigated the man who was trying to marry my daughter, and everything I found confirmed my worst fears. Julian Ashworth came from a family that had been bankrupt for 20 years. The estate, the name, the lifestyle, it was all theater. They'd lost everything to mismanagement and tax debt long before you entered the picture." Vivian stepped forward and began laying documents on the coffee table. Deed transfers, incorporation records, wire confirmations, each one stamped and notarized, building a picture so comprehensive it looked like architecture. "Your father acquired the Ashworth estate 9 years ago through a holding company," Vivian explained. "He renovated it, restructured the debt, and held it in a trust, the Okafor Family Trust, with you listed as the sole beneficiary. When Julian came looking for seed capital for his venture fund, your father provided it, every dollar, through a series of offshore entities designed to make it look like Julian had attracted independent investors." "He didn't," Nadine said. "Not a question. Not a single one. Every dollar Julian Ashworth has ever spent, on the business, on the estate, on the cars, on the lifestyle, originated from your father's accounts. Julian has been functionally an employee of your father's operation for the entirety of your marriage. He just didn't know it." Nadine looked at the documents, then at the screen, then at her sleeping daughters. "The people who called me your kind," she said slowly. "The people who told me I didn't belong. They were living in my house, spending my father's money, building their entire identity on my family's wealth." "Yes," Solomon said, "and I needed them to do it long enough and loudly enough that when the truth came out there would be no ambiguity, no he said, she said, no room for their lawyers to spin the narrative. You let me suffer so you could build a case." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. "Yes," Solomon said, "and if you never forgive me for that, I'll understand. But I had people watching you every day, Nadi. Vivian's team was never more than 15 minutes away. If they had ever physically harmed you, ever touched you, I would have intervened within the hour. But emotional cruelty." He paused. "Emotional cruelty is what judges need to see documented. Patterns, recordings, consistency. I needed the Ashworths to feel safe enough to be exactly who they were." Nadine wiped her face. Rage and gratitude and grief tangled inside her like wires she couldn't separate. "How long were you recording?" Vivian answered. 14 months, every common area in the estate, legal because the property is owned by the trust. We have recordings of Constance making racially derogatory remarks on 47 separate occasions. We have Julian admitting to associates that he married you for strategic access. We have Priscilla Langdon's presence documented from the first night she stayed at the estate, 8 months ago. We have financial records showing Julian embezzling from his own fund, And we have Priscilla siphoning money through fraudulent vendor accounts she thought no one was monitoring. She paused to let the weight settle. Every piece of evidence has been authenticated, cataloged, and prepared for court. When we move, they won't have a leg to stand on. Now listen, if you think this revelation is intense, wait until you hear what Solomon had planned for the next 2 weeks. Because what the Ashworths did while they thought they'd won, it's the kind of arrogance that writes its own death sentence. If this story is hitting different right now, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next, nobody saw it coming. Nobody. Vivian spread a timeline across the coffee table. Dates, photographs, financial summaries, each one a brick in a wall that was about to fall on the Ashworth family. Your father didn't just prepare for this moment, Vivian said. He engineered it. The plan had been built over years, with the patience of a man who understood that real power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, it documents, and when the moment is precisely right, not a day too early, not a day too late, it moves with the kind of force that leaves no room for appeal. Solomon had embedded a specific clause in the Okafor family trust, a trigger mechanism. If Nadine was ever abandoned by her spouse, expelled from the marital residence, or subjected to documented patterns of abuse, the following would activate automatically. Full ownership of the estate would transfer to Nadine's name, exclusively, irrevocably. All accounts Julian had accessed through the trust's financial infrastructure would be frozen within 48 hours. Control of Julian's venture fund, every share, every contract, every asset would revert to the trust with Nadine as the sole decision-maker. And a legal team, already retained, already briefed, already holding 14 months of evidence, would begin filing motions before Julian had time to call a lawyer. He thought of everything, Nadine whispered, turning pages of documentation that read like a battle plan. He thought of you, Vivian corrected. Every decision he made was designed to protect you, not to punish Julian, though that will happen, but to ensure that no matter what that family did to you, you would never be powerless, you would never be trapped. Nadine looked at the trust documents. Her name appeared on every page, Nadine Adeze Okafor, in her father's careful handwriting where signatures were required. He'd written her full name each time. Not initials, not abbreviations. Her full name, her Igbo name. The name her mother had chosen because it meant the daughter of a king. He'd been telling her the truth her entire life. She just hadn't known it was literal. What happens now? Nadine asked. Now, Vivian said, we wait 2 more weeks. We let Julian and Constance celebrate. We let them post on social media, throw parties, make public statements, every word they say, every photograph. They share, every claim they make about their wealth and status. It becomes evidence of a lifestyle built entirely on stolen resources. The more public they are, the more devastating the reveal. And then your father comes home, in person, to the estate, and they find out exactly whose ground they've been standing on. Something shifted in Nadine that night. Not suddenly, it wasn't a switch being flipped. It was more like a tide turning, slow, powerful, inevitable. She stopped crying, not because the pain stopped, but because something harder was forming underneath it, something cold and luminous and patient. She began reading every document in the files Vivian had given her. She memorized financial records, corporate structures, legal precedents. She asked questions, precise, surgical questions, that made Vivian raise an eyebrow more than once. Your father said you were sharp, Vivian told her on the 3rd day. He undersold it. Nadine also did something else during those 2 weeks, something that didn't appear in any legal filing or strategic timeline. She called her aunt in Lagos, her mother's sister, the woman who had raised her after her mother died, the woman whose voice sounded like home. They spoke for 3 hours. Nadine spoke in Igbo, something she hadn't done in years because Julian had once told her it made guests uncomfortable. She let the language wrap around her like a blanket she'd forgotten she owned. She told her aunt everything, and her aunt said something that lodged in Nadine's chest like an anchor. They tried to make you forget who you are, but the blood remembers, Nadi. It always remembers. While Nadine was quietly rebuilding herself 62 floors above the city, the Ashworth family was doing exactly what Solomon predicted they would do. They celebrated. Julian threw a dinner party at the estate 3 days after the expulsion. 20 guests. Catered. Champagne flowing from bottles that cost more per glass than most people's monthly rent. He stood at the head of a table Nadine had picked out, in a dining room Nadine had designed, raising a toast to new beginnings and fresh starts. Priscilla sat in Nadine's chair, wore a dress from Nadine's closet. laughed at jokes that weren't funny with a confidence that comes from believing you've already won. Constance presided over the evening like a queen restored to her throne. She told 3 separate guests that Nadine had been a charity case who overstayed her welcome. She told another that the marriage had been Julian's one major miscalculation, the kind of mistake young men make when they think with their hearts instead of their heads. She never named what she really meant. She didn't have to. Everyone at that table understood the code. They'd been speaking it their whole lives. Julian posted photographs on social media, the estate glowing in candlelight, Priscilla on his arm. A caption that read, "Some chapters end so better ones can begin." 214 likes, 37 comments, most from people who had no idea that every brick in the background of that photograph belonged to the woman he'd just thrown away. Over the next 12 days, the Ashworth family compiled an extraordinary record of their own arrogance. Vivian's surveillance team, already legally embedded in the property's security system, captured everything. Julian bragging to a business partner over whiskey that Nadine never had the sophistication for this world. Constance calling a decorator to remove every trace of that woman's taste from the estate, a property she didn't own. Priscilla ordering new furniture, new linens, new everything, charged to accounts that were about to be frozen. Julian meeting with a family lawyer to discuss filing for full custody of the twins, not because he wanted them. His exact words captured on audio. "I don't need the kids. I need the leverage. She'll sign over anything to keep them." When Vivian played that recording for Nadine, the room went very quiet. "He wants to use his own daughters as bargaining chips," Nadine said. Her voice was flat, not shocked, beyond shock now. "Yes," Vivian said. "And now we have him saying it in his own words, in his own house, on a recording that's legally admissible in any family court in this country. They were building their own prison, just like Solomon said they would. Every social media post, every party, every cruel remark, another bar on the cage. And they were doing it with smiles on their faces, champagne in their hands, and the absolute certainty that they were untouchable. They had no idea that in 4 days a motorcade would roll up their private lane, and the man they thought was dead would step out and lock the door. The countdown is almost over. Solomon Okafor is about to come home. And when I tell you what happens when he walks up to that front door, the look on Constance's face, the words he says to Julian, the moment Nadine steps out of that car and stands on the ground that was always hers, you're going to want to replay it. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because the next part of this story, it's going to change the way you see power, dignity, and what a father's love can really do. Wednesday, 9 o'clock in the morning. A morning so clear and bright it felt like the sky itself was paying attention. 3 black armored SUVs turned onto the private lane that led to the Ashworth estate. Behind them, a silver Bentley with tinted windows. Behind that, 2 additional vehicles carrying forensic accountants, legal associates, and a documentary crew that had been embedded with Vivian's team for 6 months. The motorcade moved slowly, deliberately, the kind of pace that said we are not in a hurry because we don't need to be. The neighbors noticed first. Mr. Harwell from across the lane, retrieving his morning paper. Mrs. Okonedo 3 houses down, walking her dog. They stopped, stared, pulled out their phones. By the time the vehicles reached the estate's iron gate, 7 people were already recording. The gate opened. It responded to a code Vivian entered from the lead SUV. Because the gate, like everything else on this property, belonged to the trusts. The Bentley parked at the base of the front steps. James, the driver, a man who had worked for Solomon for 15 years, opened the rear door with a slight bow. Nadine stepped out first. She wore a tailored ivory dress. Simple, architectural. Her hair was pulled back, her face was clear, and she wore a single piece of jewelry, her mother's gold pendant, the one Solomon had given her on her wedding day, the one she'd tucked into her hospital gown the night she was expelled because even in her worst moment, she'd known some things were worth carrying. She was not the woman who had walked barefoot down this lane 2 weeks ago. That woman had been broken by design, methodically stripped of confidence, identity, connection, until she believed she was nothing. This woman had been rebuilt by truth, and truth, when you finally hold it, changes the way you stand. Solomon stepped out next. He leaned on his cane. The crash had left its mark, but his presence was the kind that doesn't need physical perfection to command a room, or a lane, or an entire estate. He was 6'3", broad-shouldered, dark suit that fit like it had been made for this exact moment. His face was calm, not angry, not vengeful, calm in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface, with enough force underneath to reshape coastlines. Vivian flanked him, briefcase in hand, 2 associates behind her carrying filing boxes. They walked up the front steps together, father, daughter, and the legal apparatus of a 15-year plan reaching its final act. The front door opened before they knocked. Constance Ashworth stood there in her morning robe, coffee in hand, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something she had never in her life experienced before. Genuine, paralyzing fear. "What?" she began. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth," Vivian said. "We're here to serve legal documents regarding the ownership of this property and all associated financial assets. Is your son home?" "Julian." Constance's voice pitched upward, cracking the composure she wore like armor. "Julian, get down here, now." Julian appeared at the top of the staircase, pulling on his shirt. Priscilla trailed behind him, still half asleep, wearing one of Nadine's robes, the silk one, the one from the closet she'd been told to forget about. Julian descended slowly, his eyes moving from Vivian to the officers to the SUVs outside, and then to Nadine, and then to Solomon. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a photograph losing its ink. "You're dead," Julian whispered. Solomon looked at him for a long moment, then spoke 2 words that landed like stones dropped into still water. "Evidently not." He stepped forward. 1 step, and Julian stepped back, involuntarily, instinctively, the way something small retreats from something it cannot outrun. "3 nights ago," Solomon said, his voice quiet enough that everyone strained to hear it, which meant everyone heard every word. "You put my daughter on the street, my daughter who had given birth to your children. 48 hours earlier, you stood in this doorway, a doorway I paid for, and you watched her walk away barefoot, bleeding, holding 2 newborns in the dark, and you let the woman standing behind you laugh about it." Priscilla's face lost its sleepy softness. She took a half step behind Julian. "And your mother," Solomon turned to Constance, and his gaze was the kind that could peel paint. "Your mother looked at my daughter, at the color of her skin, and said, 'Your kind always manages, in a house that my family owns.'" Constance opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "I want you to understand something, Julian," Solomon continued. "When you married my daughter, you believed she came from nothing. I raised her to be humble. I raised her to judge people by their character, not their bank accounts, and she loved you, genuinely, completely, because she believed you were a man of substance." He paused. "I wanted to believe it too. I prayed I was wrong about you. I spent 6 years hoping you would prove me wrong." He looked at Julian with something that might have been pity if it weren't so precise. "You proved me right." Vivian stepped forward and handed Julian a folder. "Mr. Ashworth, this folder contains the original deed to this property, held in trust under Nadine Okafor's name since its acquisition in 2015. It also contains documentation proving that 100% of the capital invested in your venture fund originated from Okafor Holdings. All accounts associated with your name have been frozen as of 6 o'clock this morning. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises and remove personal belongings only." Julian's hands trembled as he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the pages. His lips moved but formed no words. "This isn't possible," he finally managed. "I signed papers. I have documentation." "You have documents your father-in-law allowed you to see," Vivian said. "Documents designed to make you feel secure while the actual ownership remained exactly where it's always been, with Nadine." "This is fraud," Constance said, finding her voice. "This is elder abuse. He manipulated—" "Mrs. Ashworth," Vivian interrupted, her tone sharpening to a point, "your family has been living in a property you don't own, spending money you didn't earn, and building a social identity on a foundation. That belongs to someone else. The only fraud documented in these files is your son's. Financial misappropriation, tax evasion, embezzlement from his own fund, all traceable, all documented, all admissible." She handed a second folder to Priscilla, who took it with hands that shook. "And Miss Langdon, you'll find records of every fraudulent vendor account you created, every falsified expense report, every dollar you siphoned from Ward Ventures thinking no one was watching. You have 2 options. Return the money and cooperate, or face criminal prosecution. Your choice." Priscilla stared at the folder like it was made of fire. Papers slipped from her fingers and scattered across the marble floor. Nadine stepped forward. For the first time, she spoke, and when she did, her voice carried across the lawn, past the officers, past the SUVs, to the neighbors who stood on the sidewalk with their phones raised, recording history. "I loved you, Julian. Honestly, completely. With everything I had. I left my home, my language, my family, because you told me this was where I belonged, and for 3 years I tried to believe it. Even when your mother made me feel like an intruder in my own home, even when you stopped coming home at night, even when I found her perfume on your collar and you told me I was imagining things. But her voice didn't crack, didn't waver. It was the voice of a woman standing on ground she'd finally claimed. But I was never the outsider in this house. You were. You were a guest in my family's home, spending my family's money, enjoying my family's legacy. And you looked at me and told me I was nothing. You told me I was dead weight. You told me I was your kind. She paused. Let the silence gather like a held breath. I am my kind. I am my father's daughter, and that's something you should have been afraid of from the very beginning. She turned and walked back to the Bentley. Solomon followed, his cane clicking against the stone steps. Vivian remained on the porch, ensuring the documents were signed and acknowledged. James opened the car door. Nadine slid inside. Through the tinted window, she watched Julian standing in the doorway of a house that was no longer his, holding a folder that contained the end of everything he'd pretended to be. Constance had sunk into a chair just inside the foyer. Her hands covered her face. The woman who had built her identity on the belief that she was above everyone else had just discovered she'd been standing on someone else's floor the entire time. The motorcade pulled away. The neighbors kept recording. By noon, the footage would be everywhere. The courtroom was full, every seat taken. Observers who'd read the headlines, watched the viral videos of the motorcade, followed the story as it exploded across social media and news outlets. They'd come to see how it ended. Nadine sat at the plaintiff's table. The twins were with Mrs. Ocanedo, the neighbor who'd been the first to call after the videos surfaced, the first to say, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Vivian sat beside Nadine, 3 associates behind them, boxes of evidence stacked with the precision of an army preparing for a final advance. Across the aisle, Julian sat with a public defender. His assets were frozen, his former attorneys had declined to represent him, and the only lawyer willing to take his case was a tired man named Gerald Foley, who shuffled papers like someone counting down to retirement. Constance was absent. Her lawyers had advised her to stay home, citing health concerns. Translation: she couldn't face the public. Priscilla Langdon sat in the witness section. She'd taken a plea deal 2 days earlier, full testimony against Julian in exchange for reduced charges on her embezzlement. Her face was drawn, empty of the confidence she'd worn like borrowed silk. Judge Monica Hargrove entered. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of judge who'd presided over enough family court cases to recognize performance, manipulation, and desperation within the first 5 minutes. The room stood, then sat. "We're here for the matter of Okafor versus Ashworth," Judge Hargrove said. "Custody determination and asset distribution. Ms. Trask, you may present your case." Vivian stood, and for the next 45 minutes, she dismantled Julian Ashworth's life with the methodical precision of someone removing load-bearing walls from a structure that was already condemned. She presented the trust documents, the original deed, the financial records tracing every dollar from Solomon's accounts through shell entities to Julian's fund. She played audio recordings, Julian telling a business partner he'd married Nadine for strategic access. Julian telling his lawyer he wanted custody, not because I want the kids, but because they're leverage. Constance calling Nadine that African girl in a phone call to a society friend. She played the recording from the night of the expulsion. Julian's voice flat and mechanical. "Useful has an expiration date, and yours passed the moment those babies were born." The courtroom was silent, not the silence of boredom or indifference. The silence of a room full of people realizing they were witnessing something that would be discussed for years. Julian's lawyer attempted a defense. He argued that the trust documents might be fraudulent, that Solomon's disappearance constituted suspicious behavior, that Nadine might be mentally unstable. Vivian responded with authenticated notarizations, independent forensic verification of every document, and psychiatric evaluations Nadine had voluntarily completed, all confirming her as a woman of exceptional stability and resilience. She then called Priscilla Langdon to the stand. Priscilla confirmed everything: the affair, the embezzlement, Julian's character, his contempt for Nadine, his intentions with the children. She spoke in a flat monotone, staring at the table, and when she finished, she walked out of the courtroom without looking at Julian once. Julian asked to make a statement. Judge Hargrove allowed it. He stood, straightened his tie, and tried to be the charming man he'd always believed himself to be. "Your Honor, I love my children. I want to be their father, whatever mistakes I've made. Mr. Ashworth, Judge Hargrove interrupted. Her voice was level, but her eyes were granite. I have listened to recordings of you calling your children assets. I have listened to you describe your marriage as a strategic transaction. I have reviewed evidence of financial fraud, marital infidelity, and conduct toward your wife that can only be described as systematic emotional abuse. Do you have anything to add that isn't already contradicted by your own recorded words? Julian opened his mouth, closed it, sat down. Judge Hargrove delivered her ruling. Full custody of the twins to Nadine Okafor. All trust assets confirmed as Nadine's exclusive property. Julian granted supervised visitation only, pending completion of a court-mandated counseling program. Constance Ashworth issued a restraining order prohibiting contact with Nadine or the children. Julian's venture fund placed in receivership, pending a full fraud investigation. The gavel fell. Nadine stood, walked out of the courtroom into a hallway where Solomon waited, leaning on his cane, his eyes bright with something that might have been pride or relief or both. She walked into his arms, and for a long moment, in a corridor that smelled like old wood and new justice, a father held his daughter, and neither of them needed to say a word. In the back of the Bentley, driving away from the courthouse, Nadine rested her head against her father's shoulder. The twins had been brought to the car. They slept between them, peaceful, unaware, wrapped in the kind of safety that only exists when someone has loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your protection. "Thank you, Papa," Nadine whispered. Solomon kissed the top of her head, the way he had when she was 5 years old, when the world was simple, when he could protect her from everything with just the sound of his voice. "You never have to thank me for that. You just have to promise me something." "What?" "Teach those girls what your mother taught you, that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. It's something you carry. And when people try to strip it away, when they try to make you small because of where you're from, or what you look like, or what they think they know about you, you don't fight with their weapons. You stand in your own light, and you let the truth do the rest." Nadine looked at her daughters, their perfect faces, their tiny hands, the future stretching out before them like an open road in morning light. "I promise," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of who she was. In the months that followed, Nadine took control of the venture fund, restructured it from the ground up, and renamed it the Adesi Fund, after her mother. She hired women. She invested in communities. She built something that mattered. Solomon retired from his empire and moved to be near his granddaughters. He walked them through parks and told them stories in Igbo, the same stories his wife had told Nadine, the same words, the same rhythms, passed down like heirlooms that no one could steal. Julian Ashworth faced criminal charges for financial fraud. His trial was pending. He lived in a rented studio apartment and worked for a staffing agency. His social media accounts were deleted. Constance Ashworth lost her position on every society board she'd ever sat on. The women who had once competed for her approval stopped returning her calls. She lived alone in a rented townhouse surrounded by the silence she'd earned. Priscilla Langdon disappeared from public life entirely. And Nadine woke up every morning in a house that was truly hers, fed her daughters, and looked out at a city that now knew her name. Not because she'd been loud, not because she'd been vengeful, but because she'd been patient and dignified and unbreakable. Her father's lesson, her mother's legacy, her own becoming. Now listen, if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, I need you to do 3 things for me. First, hit that like button. Not for me, for every person who's been underestimated, looked down on, made to feel like they don't belong. Let this story reach them. Second, subscribe to Love Chronicles with Mr. Incredible. We don't just tell stories here. We tell stories that change how you see the world. And third, drop a comment below. Tell me, what would you have done in Nadine's shoes? What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you tried to erase you? I read every single comment, and I want to hear your voice. Until next time, remember this: your dignity is not negotiable. Your value is not determined by how others treat you. And the people who look down on you, they might just be standing on ground that belongs to you. Stay blessed, stay powerful, and never, ever let anyone tell you what you're worth. This is Mr. Incredible, and I'll see you in the next one.